I don't imagine that the US or the Chinese governments really had much of a response to this wave of migration. I think both of them were sort of at a loss as to both how to think about it strategically, how to think about it diplomatically. But for me, it's become increasingly clear that this migration is actually embarrassing for China.
My name is Meredith Oyen. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County.
My name is Gil. I'm an immigration policy analyst at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Leland Lazarus. I'm the Associate Director at Florida International University's Gordon Institute for Public Policy.
We're here on behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations to talk today a little bit about the problem of Chinese irregular migration at the southern border. We'll start with asking for an overview. Gil, the surge in irregular Chinese migration over the U.S. southern border that began in 2023 has inspired a lot of commentary and a lot of interest. Can we start by putting it in context and telling us what we know about this migration and who's coming and why?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks to you for moderating this, and thanks to the committee for having us. So this trend has really picked up within the past 2 years. And, to put the numbers into a bit more specific context, the total since January of 2024 of irregular encounters that have been had with Chinese migrants at the southern border is 18,469, which is about a 43% increase from the same period in 2023, which is 12,855, which again, so far, if you think 43%, that increase is large, but not really staggering. But in 2021, there were only 202 encounters. So in that same period, in the course of 3 years, we've gone up by about 9,000%, which I think is really the result of a number of factors that we've seen. Obviously, some of it can be attributed to the increase in travel after the COVID-19 pandemic. Travel restrictions were lifted. But for me, there are other factors that you can point to. You can talk about the economic slowdown in China. You can talk about increasing political repression. But the one that I think is really unique as to why this is taking off now is social media. Because if you think about the way that people have migrated to the US historically, it's almost always a family member or a religious community or a neighbor. But you had someone there already in the US telling you, this is how you migrate, this is where you land, this is how you get a job, this is how you assimilate, etc. And that for a lot of people early on, unless you were really adventurous, was really a big barrier to migrating in the past. And now, through the use of video media, the barrier for that has really been reduced because you can essentially now go on TikTok or the Chinese equivalent, which is Douyin, and see videos, first of all, of people who are actually making the journey, people you consider peers, to kind of ignite that initial thought of, hey, I grew up with this person, or I don't know this person well, but they seem like they're in a similar station in life to me. So therefore, if they do it, then I can too. But you could also see how you travel to Ecuador, or now increasingly Bolivia, how you get through the Darien Gap, how you get through Central America, through Mexico, all via video, which is a lot more instructive than photo or text. And it's also something that can be rapidly and quickly updated. And again, the more people and the more migrants make these journeys, the more videos are produced, the easier it is to keep track of. So again, those are the numbers. And I think that's the context of why this migration is happening now to such a degree, such an exponential rate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Leland, could you explain a little more about the paths to the U.S. that are used by Chinese irregular migrants, how they've changed as the U.S. and other transit countries' policies have changed, and what makes this new influx? I think Gil sort of addressed this. What makes the new influx of Chinese migration different from past trends?
Well, just as what Gil said, irregular Chinese migration isn't necessarily new. I mean, you can see from history, all the way back from the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, of ways in which Chinese families and networks were using different ways in order to illegally enter the United States. I think of the paper sons and the paper daughters entering into San Francisco in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then, of course, there was a huge issue in the early 1990s when the Golden Venture, which was a large ship that contained almost 300 illegal Chinese migrants that entered onto Rockaway Beach in New York, where I am right now. Now, what's different, of course, is the scale and also the way in which these Chinese illegal migrants are entering into the United States. Previously, it hadn't really been through Latin America and the Caribbean. But now, as Gil had mentioned, you see whether it be Douyin or Weixin or Weibo, all these different videos and also sort of PDFs with a step-by-step guide on how do you enter into the southwest border through Latin America and the Caribbean. And so usually the path is you leave China, you fly over to Turkey, and then from Turkey, you fly over to Quito, Ecuador, because until recently, Ecuador had a visa-free agreement with Chinese citizens. And then from there, you take a series of buses all the way up through Colombia, through Necoclí. You either take other buses or you take a lancha or a boat to get over to Darien. And then you make your way all the way up through Central America, through Mexico, and then sort of give yourself up at the US Southwest border. If you have a little bit more money, you can take direct flights to Nicaragua or to El Salvador, or there are even some cases of going to the Bahamas and then entering to the US that way. And so these are some of the ways in which Chinese migrants are entering into the US. There are multiple ways, and there are cheaper options and there's more expensive options for your socioeconomic status.
Can we talk a little bit about the reasons why they're coming? It's not just, yes, there's all these new ways of coming and there's all this new information about how to come, but why come at all?
I think that there really has been a sense of an economic slowdown. So, as Leland said, most of the data that we're able to compile about these migrants comes from really a combination of government data in the region. And again, until recently, we had a really unique situation where, because so many of them were entering through Ecuador, you could actually look at the Ecuadorian entry data and from that glean basically a demographic snapshot of who they are. And for the most part, about 40% of the migrants are in their 30s. 2/3 of them are men. Most of them are middle collar or middle skilled or high skilled professionals who, for the most part, again, had their savings wiped out in the COVID-19 pandemic. They were not exactly the kind of people who would usually be able to come to the US on an H-1B high skilled visa, but they were small business owners who were able to essentially liquidate their holdings and then pay the 20,000 or 25,000 or so journey to the US, in large part because I think that they were seeing that in China there was not really much of a future for them. Again, most of these people are male, which here in the US has led to some headlines about military-age males. But again, realistically, my hypothesis for why this is, apart from it just being a safer journey to undertake if you are a young man, is that the one-child policy really left a big demographic gap in China. And so again, you have a lot of men in China who have the disposable income possible to really start over. And when they're looking at China, I don't think that they see much of a future for them in terms of potential for a spouse, in terms of competition for jobs, competition socially. I think a lot of them are attracted to the idea of the US still. I think that in combination with, again, heightened political repression in Xinjiang and Hong Kong and some other regions has also really contributed to this desire to leave China for the US and try to start anew here.
Mm-hmm. Can I just tack on to that a question about the asylum approval rate? Because the Chinese asylum approval rate in the United States is unusually high. It's higher than other groups. It's in December 2023, it was 73.7% of applicants were granted asylum. That's higher than the 48.5% average of all applications across the US. So why is the acceptance rate so much higher for the Chinese applicant? And does that play a role in convincing people to migrate?
Well, it might sound self-evident, but in order to really qualify for asylum and have a successful application, it does help to have legal representation and legal help, and it also helps to have a credible claim. And I think that for various reasons, Chinese migrants disproportionately have both. So if you look at, for example, many of the migrants coming from, say, Central or even South America, a lot of them tend to be fleeing because of criminal violence or poor economic conditions in those countries, which, while horrible and which we can be sympathetic to, are typically not treated as something that can actually be an asylum claim. You have a much better chance of being granted asylum if you're being persecuted for an immutable quality, something like your gender, your ethnicity, your religion, or even your political party and your political involvement. And I think that naturally Chinese migrants tend to have much better claims in those regards, or at least much more plausible claims of facing that sort of persecution within China than, say, the vast majority of other migrants. There are also the Chinese diaspora here in the US, the places that offer Chinese language services. tend to be fairly prosperous compared to other immigrant groups. They tend to have, in that sense, also more legal representation and more legal aid clinics in Mandarin that tend to offer them aid. So again, it's a very small subset of the population, but it is one that, again, here in the US has been relatively successful. And you combine that with the fact that the migrants, again, if you are leaving, say, from Central America, not that journey is not logistically complex, but if you're leaving all the way from China and you're planning out this multi-step journey, you're going to have a plan once you get here on what to do. It's not as if you can just simply try again if you get turned back. I think a lot of times it really selects for people who have a very clear understanding of the US legal system and also think that they have a reasonable shot at getting asylum. So I think you take that into combination, that explains some of the very high asylum approval rates that we see from Chinese migrants.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I want to turn to something that Gil mentioned or alluded to earlier. Some members of Congress have raised questions about the national security implications of this surge in Chinese migrants. What kinds of concerns do they express? How much of that is realistic? And are there real national security concerns that we should be concerned with?
Some politicians have said that because the number of the Chinese migrants are disproportionately male, that China is somehow building a male army along the US southwest border. Now, of course, these exaggerations are not necessarily helpful. There is no clear evidence of that. However, it does point to a larger fact of to what extent are we properly vetting each and every one of the Chinese migrants that are entering into the southwest border. We know that the PRC is trying to find every way in order to increase surveillance, increase espionage within the United States. You've got increased cyber attacks. And so we have to make sure that, again, every single one of the Chinese migrants that are coming into the southwest border are properly vetted. Unfortunately, because of the huge increase of Chinese migrants, many of the CBP officials, they may be Spanish speakers, but they may not know Mandarin. They certainly wouldn't know Fujianhua or Guangdonghua or any of these other dialects that some of the Chinese migrants may speak. And so the ability to properly vet is limited. And I think it is something that we need to focus on going forward.
Gil, can you talk a little bit about the policy responses that have come from the US government in response to the rising migration, specifically things like caps on the number of individuals who can claim asylum, diplomacy, increasing cooperation with China over repatriation flights? How successful are these measures in deterring migration?
Sure. So the total of Chinese migration has, if you hear the number 30 or 40,000 over the past year, you think that's quite a lot. But in reality, it's only about 1.3% of total southwest border encounters. So to that end, there have been really very few policy changes that have been specifically, to my mind, targeted as far as the US government response to Chinese migrants. One of the few, to what Leland just described, is that they did change the screening questions for Chinese migrants because we have so few Mandarin speakers who work in customs and border protection. So essentially, the normal screening includes 40 questions or 40 or so areas. We essentially reduced that down to 5, which are military service, ties to certain specific universities, whether or not the migrant was born in Xinjiang or has a tie to Xinjiang, whether they're employed in science, technology, medicine, finance, or government service, and also whether they express an affiliation with the Chinese Communist Party. So if a migrant presents themselves and they answer affirmatively or they get flagged on any of those questions, they're essentially separated for further screening by the Tactical Terrorism Response Team. But outside of that, it's been relatively difficult to parse out any real specific government change or policy that has been targeted specifically at these migrants. We have seen, interestingly, more broadly how the Chinese migration routes have changed somewhat over time. So during the start of the crackdown in Texas on migrants at the border, and also the repeal of Title 42, all of a sudden you had a really big shift. Before that, a majority of the Chinese migrants were arriving in the Texas sectors of the border, and now over 90% are arriving in California and the San Diego sector also, which to me again indicates that given both how much these migrants tend to pay for the governments they transit to and through the agents that they interact with during their journey there, the incentive for the migration to continue over time is going to remain the same. And I think it's really just a matter of routes more so than any real sort of deterrent that we've seen so far.
Meredith, could I just add some more to that?
Yeah.
Which is one of my first jobs in the State Department as a Foreign Service officer was as a consular officer over in the U.S. consulate in Shenyang, China, in the Northeast. And what we saw even back then, several years ago, was a complex network. We call them 中介, right? Or middlemen, right? Who would help people prepare for their visa interview, help them to say things so that they can get their B1, B2 visa. And then they get their visa, they go over to LA or Sacramento or Flushing Queen in New York or Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And then there are also, various law firms, either legitimate or not so much, who can assist in telling a story about ways in order to necessarily get asylum, right? And then also in these areas, which are, of course, historically Chinese hubs or Chinese immigration hubs, like a Flushing, you can easily sort of get jobs there. You can work in sort of a restaurant or a laundry area. But one thing I want to mention is an increase of these illegal smuggling networks, these illegal Chinese networks that are really in multiple areas throughout the United States and are increasingly relying on Chinese illegal migrants to staff, say, marijuana farms that are in Oklahoma and Maine and California. And so this is also a law enforcement issue. It becomes potentially a forced labor issue because a lot of the working conditions on some of these areas are absolutely horrible. And it is something that really both U.S. federal and local law enforcement need to really up their game in addressing.
Thank you. Leland, we're going to stay with you for a minute and ask, Gil referenced that the Ecuador has suspended its visa-free policy for Chinese citizens in July, and that there's new routes that include places like Bolivia. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened? Like, is it a result of pressure from the US or Chinese government? Is it likely to work? Is it likely to have a significant impact on reducing numbers?
I mean, it absolutely was a product of diplomacy on the part of the United States. I think whether it will have an impact, we still need to sort of wait and see, right? Mm-hmm. What we know is that other countries also have either visa waiver programs. Suriname is another one. And then other countries have also become other transit areas for Chinese migrants. Bolivia is one, Nicaragua is another. And so it's really going to have to take diplomacy with multiple countries in order to make sure this is addressed. Another key country in this whole network, we've mentioned it before, is, of course, Panama, El Tapón de Darién. Now, the current and new president of Panama, José Molino, he has pledged to shut down the Darién border. And so that will also have a very significant impact if and when that is absolutely executed. But we'll have to wait and see.
So on the diplomatic front here, Gil, what's the significance of the recent deportation flight to China? Why did China previously resist repatriation of Chinese nationals? Why is the cooperation there now? Is there a possibility that cooperation on this issue can actually translate to cooperation in other areas? Because this is a relationship that has been increasingly tense. Can you just speak a little bit about that?
Right. So I think part of the reason why that flight really captured so much media attention is that we hadn't had a repatriation flight to China really since 2018, and China rescinded all cooperation with our deportation measures in 2022 following Nancy Pelosi's visits to Taiwan. As far as why it's happening now, I really think that for a long time, I don't imagine that the US or the Chinese governments really had much of a response to this wave of migration. I think both of them were sort of at a loss as to both how to think about it strategically, how to think about it diplomatically. But for me, it's become increasingly clear that this migration is actually embarrassing for China. Again, one of the theories we discussed earlier was that this is an intentional ploy by the Chinese to try to send just waves of unvetted migrants into the US. But again, I think really to that note and to what Leland said, if you look at the actors who actually facilitate irregular migration in the region, the biggest one for me is Nicaragua, which has signed treaty-free travel or visa-free travel agreements in recent years with Kyrgyzstan, with Qatar, with Angola. Nicaragua's economy is completely penetrated by China. If China actually wanted to have this migration happen, then they could very easily get Nicaragua to sign a unilateral or one-sided visa-free travel policy with them. That would give the Nicaraguan government and economy a lot of money. It would be a lot easier for the Chinese migrants who then wouldn't have to go through the Darien Gap. So when I was looking at this issue, one of my real questions is why hasn't that happened? Especially when, again, the Ortega government in Nicaragua has been so willing to do that with much smaller countries that provide both much smaller benefits in terms of the economic aspect of it, in terms of how much that migration matters to the US, which then the Ortega government can use essentially as a leverage against sanctions on his country. I really think all signs indicate to me that China is increasingly embarrassed. One, that so many middle class young people are leaving the country. You know, if you're trying to reposition yourself on the world stage as a real peer rival to the US in terms of economic, social, cultural power, the fact that people are willing to take such desperate measures, I think, is something that they very much do not want to be painted as, again, in the world stage. And also, I think that this image potentially of Chinese migrants coming here and being seen as spies, or to what Leland said, increasingly stories are coming out of them working in marijuana farms and being forced into really bad conditions, I think also hurts them, both in terms of their image, but also in terms of US-China relations. So it just adds another sort of thorny issue to it. So I think at this stage, it is both helpful whether you are a Republican or a Democrat. I think there's a lot of concern about the porousness of the border, the overall numbers of the border, especially the new kinds of migrants coming from Western Hemispheric countries, whether it's China, India, or Russia. So on the US side, there's a lot of pressure to essentially tamp down on migration, just in terms of sheer raw skill of it. And on the Chinese side, I think there's an increasing willingness to cooperate with us because, again, this migration for them is, I think, increasingly becoming an embarrassment.
Can you put this migration in the southern border into the broader context of migration, of Chinese migration to the US, and particularly irregular Chinese migration to the US? Because these are not the only people who are coming who then don't end up being fully documented, right?
Right. And, you know, I almost want to just, I know that you've written on this and you've written on sort of the history of Chinese migration to a greater degree than I can. So I almost want to do this, Uno, on you. Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
I mean, my first thought is Leland's point about the forced labor and the labor conditions and those kinds of things. That is something that has long been a difficult issue for illegal migration, right? People coming who are trafficked essentially sometimes on tourist visas and then overstayed and have their passports confiscated and end up in really difficult working conditions. And that seems to fly under the radar, even though it's been a significant problem, I would say, for decades. Whereas this recent migration has gotten so much press. And so this has really gotten a lot more attention. And so it's good to see the two of you linking those issues, I think, because it's part of a broader problem of what do you do with this kind of irregular migration? What are the human rights implications of it? And then what are the implications for US-China relations? How does this impede cooperation, or how can it provide an opportunity for cooperation if we're trying to help people get out of those situations? So that's my take on it. I think there's a context there that's really important that we sometimes get lost in the sort of the romance of the southern border, and like how strange to have a large group of Chinese coming over the southern border. And in fact, there's a much bigger Chinese population in the US.
Right. I like to just add to that a little bit. You know, the point here is to make sure that this issue does not get racialized, right? But I think that if you were to look through, again, all the way back to 1882, all the way to today, this idea of, you know, yellow peril, right? And China having an outsized image as somehow being threatening to US and US national interest, right? So the idea for US policymakers is to, yes, address this issue, but make sure that it does not become racialized. It is not being sort of used for political purposes. But at the same time, we are actually using the right amount of resources to address this kind of issue.
I mean, I think that's really critical because the rhetoric I think matters, and we've seen that in the anti-Asian movements that have been increasing in the post-COVID, during COVID and after COVID, the pandemic. So the kind of rhetoric that we use to talk about this population is significant and important. Both of you, I want to ask both of you if you can talk about U.S. responses to Chinese irregular migration. Are they something that should be considered as part of a broader U.S. policy toward China? And then if so, like how would those responses fit into the stated opinions on China by the two current candidates for president, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? Do you see implications for how this issue should be treated by them in their China policy going forward?
I don't see, I think that there will be obviously a massive difference between the two candidates in terms of their overall policy towards immigration. As far as the migrants, I think who are already here, who are already having their asylum claims processed, I think this way the asylum system works. I think for the migrants, again, who are already here, I don't know that there will be that much difference. But as far as what the US government, I think, can and should do, there are two acts that are currently in Congress for consideration. One is the Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act, and the other one is the Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act. So basically, both of those would designate refugees from those two regions as priority two refugees in the processing system, which would give them higher consideration. And it also allows them to enter the US refugee program without having a referral from UNHCR, an embassy, or an NGO. So I think that there are some things that essentially, if you want to limit irregular immigration, if you want to limit essentially bogus asylum claims, I do think you need to make the pathway overall easier for the people who actually have valid and legitimate asylum claims. But more broadly, I think that, it's very strange to me in some ways that the position taken by China hawks on this issue is not to take more migrants, even those who are not necessarily from persecuted regions. Because again, if you are an American China hawk, and you are looking at, again, the Chinese economy, their overall capacity, the kind of both resources and literal manpower they need to achieve their national security goals, why would you not want to take relatively young and able-bodied and productive men out of China into the US, where they will instead be paying taxes in the US, and where instead they will be here within the US. It seems to me that if you actually wanted to compete with China, obviously one component of it is actually helping the people there who are being persecuted, but our one is, actually tapping into that kind of demographic and comparative advantage that we have in that sense. Unfortunately, I don't think that that is the overall lens that they will come to view it through, but I do think that from a strategic standpoint, were I a policymaker, I think that's one that I believe should have a lot more salience.
Leland, can you weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I want to reiterate that this issue does not become a racialized issue, right? And that it is becoming a part of sort of the border and immigration political issues that's going to be so salient for the November elections. But it's so much larger than that, right? I mean, it involves national security, it involves economic relations, right? The fact that there are so many Chinese young people who are willing to leave their country. On social media, you have this whole idea of 躺平, right? Or to lie flat. 20% youth unemployment, a housing bubble that's ready to pop at any moment, provincial and municipal debt that's the largest it's been in many times, and a decrease in foreign direct investment within China. All of these are reasons for why Chinese young and working age people are trying to find some other way, right? On social media, there's also this idea of 润学, right? Of runology, right? Of finding ways to run out of China. These are all important and salient data points to show the difficulty of China's current economic issue, right? But again, whether it be Republicans or Democrats, this is an issue in which we need to increase resources. The Justice Department needs to increase resources to this. We need to work with the Chinese communities in Flushing, Queens, in LA, in order to make sure that the migrants that are coming to the United States are not being abused by these groups for forced labor, for sex trafficking, and much worse.
Thank you. And we have to wrap it up here. So Gil, Leland, thank you so much for offering your expertise on this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.